In 1915, the Purity Distilling Company decided that Boston's North End was the perfect place for a massive industrial storage tank. This was not a small container tucked into a warehouse. This was a steel giant, 50 feet tall and 90 feet across, with the capacity to hold over 2 million gallons of molasses. And they chose to put it in one of the most congested, working-class neighborhoods in the city, squeezed between houses, factories, and the busy elevated train tracks. The location alone was questionable. The North End was a maze of narrow streets, families living in cramped apartments, and constant movement from wagons, trains, and pedestrians. Putting a towering tank of sticky liquid in the middle of it was asking for trouble. The tank wasn't just in a bad spot, it was built in a hurry. The company wanted it ready fast because molasses prices were high during World War I. Molasses wasn't just for baking. It was a key ingredient in making industrial alcohol, which could be used in munitions. Speed meant money, and money meant cutting corners. The steel plates were thinner than they should have been, the rivets weren't as strong as the design demanded, and the welding was sloppy. To make matters worse, the tank was never properly tested. In an ideal world, they would have filled it with water first to check for leaks and structural weaknesses. Instead, they filled it with molasses almost immediately. Soon, the people in the neighborhood started to notice something strange. The tank groaned, it hissed, it leaked. Thick, dark molasses dripped down the sides, pooling on the ground. Children came by with cups to collect the sweet liquid, treating it like a free candy stand. Adults, on the other hand, saw it as a warning sign. A structure that big should not make those sounds or lose its contents like a slow bleed. But when residents complained, Purity Distilling brushed it off. The company's response was not to fix the tank but to paint it brown so the leaks wouldn't be as visible. The location added another layer of risk. Just a few feet away, elevated train cars rumbled along the tracks. The vibrations shook nearby buildings, and no doubt rattled the already weakened tank. Summers in Boston could get hot, and in the winter, sudden temperature swings weren't uncommon. These changes caused the steel to expand and contract, further stressing the poorly fastened seams, yet the company kept pumping molasses into it, pushing it to maximum capacity. By January 1919, the tank was nearly full, and the weather had been particularly erratic. A sudden warm spell caused the molasses inside to ferment and expand. Pressure built within the tank like a bomb waiting to go off. But there was no sense of urgency from the company, no reinforcement of the structure, no draining to relieve the load. The assumption was that the tank had held this long, so it would continue to hold. The decision to place such a massive, unstable structure in the middle of a densely populated neighborhood wasn't just poor engineering. It was poor judgment on every possible level. Imagine if someone suggested today putting a skyscraper-sized container of flammable liquid right next to a school and a commuter rail station, then skipping safety tests because they didn't want to delay profits. That's essentially what Purity Distilling did. They valued speed and cost savings over public safety, trusting that luck would keep everything in place. The irony is that Boston's North End wasn't a place where people could easily avoid danger. The streets were narrow, hemmed in by tightly packed buildings. There was no open space to run to if something went wrong. The elevated train tracks might have looked like a barrier, but in reality, they would funnel disaster through the neighborhood like a channel. The city's dense layout amplified the danger, but it also seemed invisible to those who signed off on the project. There is a kind of arrogance that comes with industrial confidence when a company believes it can build something enormous. Drop it in the middle of a city, and everything will be fine because they say so. The Purity Distilling Company embodied that mindset. They treated engineering limits as inconveniences, community safety as an afterthought, and early warning signs as minor annoyances. The leaking tank wasn't a problem, it was just a little molasses, after all. The groaning metal wasn't a risk, it was just the sound of a big tank doing its job. What makes the decision so baffling is that Boston was no stranger to industrial accidents. Fires in factories, structural collapses, and machinery mishaps had claimed lives before. But this was different. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen inside a factory's walls. It was a massive hazard placed in the open, where thousands of people passed by it every day. Anyone who walked under the tracks could look up and see the giant, dark cylinder looming over them. It was the kind of thing that should have made decision-makers stop and think about what would happen if it failed. But the thinking never went that far. Instead, the company operated under the dangerous belief that because something hadn't failed yet, it never would. They saw no need to listen to the community or to err on the side of caution. The north end was just a convenient spot for storage, close to the harbor for shipping and to the rail line for distribution. That convenience outweighed the risks in their minds. It's one thing when a brilliant mind makes a small, personal mistake that costs them a fortune or ruins a relationship. It's another when a group of supposedly competent industrial planners, engineers, and executives make a collective decision so short-sighted that an entire neighborhood is put at risk. The Purity Distilling Company didn't just build a tank in the wrong place, they built it wrong in the wrong place, then ignored every warning sign that followed. It was an act of industrial hubris. The kind of poor judgment that makes you wonder how people smart enough to run a major business could be blind to such obvious danger. The massive molasses tank that loomed over Boston's North End wasn't the result of careful planning or meticulous engineering. It was slapped together in just a few months by a crew that had no formal training in building large steel structures. The steel plates they used were thinner than industry standards, closer to what you might expect in a cheap storage shed than in a container meant to hold millions of gallons of heavy, sticky liquid. The seams were fastened with rivets that weren't strong enough to bear the constant strain. The workmanship was crude, and anyone with real engineering experience would have spotted the flaws immediately. But those people were never brought in. Purity Distilling wanted speed. The First World War had created a booming demand for molasses as a raw material for industrial alcohol. Every day the tank sat unfinished was a day of lost profit. So instead of hiring qualified engineers to design and oversee the project, the company relied on basic laborers to assemble it like an oversized backyard project. The crew followed loose instructions and improvised solutions as they went along. It was the kind of corner cutting you might expect from someone building a chicken coop, not from a major company constructing one of the largest storage tanks in the country. In proper engineering practice, a tank of that size would have gone through rigorous inspection before it ever saw a drop of molasses. A standard water test would have been used to check for leaks and to verify that the structure could handle the weight and pressure of being filled to capacity. That never happened here. The tank was filled with molasses almost immediately after construction, skipping every safety step in the book. It was like buying a brand new ship and sending it across the ocean without ever checking if the hull was watertight. The flaws were obvious to anyone who lived nearby. Within days of being filled, the tank began to leak. Thick, dark molasses oozed out between the rivets and dribbled down the sides. This wasn't tea, a tiny drippet was enough for children in the neighborhood to collect in tin cans as a free treat. To the residents, the constant seepage was a clear sign that something was wrong. But when complaints reached the company, the solution wasn't to drain the tank and fix it. Instead, Purity Distilling painted the tank brown to make the leaks harder to see. They literally covered up the problem with a coat of paint, choosing appearances over safety. The danger wasn't just in the leaks. The steel was so thin that it flexed under the pressure of the molasses inside. Every shift in temperature made the metal expand and contract, stressing the rivets further. The winter cold made the steel brittle, and when the weather warmed suddenly, the contents swelled and pushed outward. The tank groaned audibly, like a living thing under strain. These sounds were ignored, as if a giant metal drum complaining in the middle of a crowded neighborhood was nothing unusual. The lack of professional oversight was staggering. No licensed engineer signed off on the design. No inspector verified that the construction met basic safety requirements. It was built entirely on the assumption that if it looked solid enough from the outside, it would be fine. This mindset wasn't just reckless, it was rooted in a dangerous overconfidence. The executives at Purity Distilling assumed that because they were in the business of making money from molasses, they automatically knew how to store it safely. Imagine a company today deciding to build a massive oil tank in a city park, using local handymen instead of specialists, and then skipping all safety tests to start pumping it full immediately. That's essentially what happened here. The difference is that in 1915 there were fewer regulations, and companies could get away with it if they had the right connections and kept costs low. Even the basic choice of materials showed how little thought went into the project. The steel used for the tank contained too little manganese, making it more prone to cracking under pressure, something any competent metallurgist could have told them. But no metallurgist was ever asked. Instead, cost and speed took priority over durability. The rivets themselves were of inconsistent quality, some hammered in unevenly, leaving small gaps that became weak points. These were exactly the spots where molasses began to leak first. As the months passed, the tank became part of the neighborhood's daily life. People got used to seeing it, hearing it, and even smelling it. That familiarity bred a false sense of security. The fact that it hadn't T-burst yet seemed to reassure both the residents and the company that it never would. But the truth was that every day it stood there, full to the brim. It was one temperature swing or one structural shift away from disaster. This wasn't the mistake of one single worker making a bad weld or a manager approving a slightly thinner plate than recommended. It was a failure at every level, from the design phase to the final inspection that never happened. The people in charge either didn't know enough to see the danger, or didn't care enough to stop and fix it. It was a perfect example of how intelligent people, or at least people trusted to make big decisions, can do something astonishingly foolish when profit is on the line. The tank was a DIY project in the worst possible way. Big, improvised, and dangerously underbuilt. It wasn't an example of clever resourcefulness, it was a gamble, and it was placed right in the middle of a living, breathing community. The thin steel, the amateur assembly, the skipped tests, and the painted-over leaks all pointed toward a single truth. The people responsible believed that getting the tank up quickly mattered more than making sure it was safe, and they were willing to bet an entire neighborhood's safety on that belief. The warnings came early, and they came from the people who had the most to lose. Residents in Boston's North End could see the Molasses tank towering above their streets, a steel giant wedged into a tight, busy neighborhood. They saw how quickly it had been built, how unpolished and rough the work looked, and they noticed the leaks that began to appear almost immediately. These were not just harmless little drips. Thick, slow streams of molasses bled out from the seams, leaving dark streaks that hardened in the sun. A local neighborhood association decided enough was enough. They put together their concerns and took them to the city, warning that the tank was unsafe. They spoke about the leaks. They mentioned the strange groaning noises it made during the day and the loud pops at night when the steel contracted in the cold. They didn't have engineering degrees, but they knew what a disaster waiting to happen looked like. Their message could be summed up in a single phrase: let's not do that. The city's reaction was predictable for the time. These were working-class residents, many of them immigrants, raising concerns against a wealthy industrial company that brought in tax money and had powerful friends. Their complaints were heard, but they were not acted upon. In effect, the city shrugged. Officials trusted the company to manage its own affairs, assuming that Purity Distilling wouldn't risk its investment by cutting dangerous corners. It was the kind of blind faith in big business that was common in the early 20th century, long before modern safety regulations were in place. It didn't help that the company projected confidence. When confronted, they dismissed the leaks as minor and cosmetic, assuring everyone that the tank was perfectly sound. The brown paint they had slapped on to cover the molasses stains was presented as routine maintenance, not a cover-up. And for city officials, many of whom probably never laid eyes on the tank themselves, those assurances were good enough. Why question a business that had the money to build something so large in the first place? This wasn't a case of nobody seeing the danger. It was a case of people in power choosing not to look too closely. It was easier for city officials to believe the company than to risk upsetting a politically connected enterprise. In a way, it's the same kind of thinking that leads to ignoring a strange rattle in your car engine because the mechanic tells you it's probably fine. Except in this case, the engine was the size of a building and parked in the middle of a densely packed neighborhood. The residents, however, kept talking. Parents warned their children not to play too close to the tank, though the kids often ignored them, drawn by the sweet smell and the thrill of sneaking a taste from the leaks. Shopkeepers noticed the way the steel walls seemed to bulge slightly in the middle, like the sides of an overfilled barrel. Every time a train rattled by on the elevated tracks next to the tank, it made the ground shake, and some locals wondered if the constant vibration was slowly weakening the structure. But in the eyes of the company, and by extension the city, these were just anxious neighbors, people prone to overreacting. After all, nothing bad had happened yet, and the tank had been full for months. If the residents were really worried, the thinking went, it was because they didn't understand industrial progress. This was modern America, and modern America meant giant steel tanks full of molasses towering over your street. This attitude wasn't just arrogance, it was laziness dressed up as confidence. Purity Distilling saw the complaints as a nuisance, not as valuable feedback. They didn't stop to consider that the people living around the tank were, in their own way, the most qualified to notice problems. They saw it every day. They heard it at night. They were the ones close enough to feel the subtle tremors in the ground, or to notice a fresh streak of molasses running down the side. And the city, instead of playing the role of impartial referee, took sides without admitting it. By doing nothing, they gave their silent approval to the company's version of events. No extra inspections were ordered. No one came with measuring tools or pressure gauges to check the steel's strength. The complaints simply faded into the background noise of urban life, buried under the hum of trolleys, the calls of street vendors, and the hiss of steam escaping from factory vents. Looking back, it's hard not to see this as one of those moments where intelligent people, or at least people trusted with the public's safety, did something incredibly foolish. They had a clear warning, delivered in plain language by the very people whose lives were at stake, and they ignored it, not because they had secret knowledge proving the tank was safe, but because it was easier to assume it was safe than to deal with the possibility that it was in T. The irony is almost painful. The same city government that would later send out rescue teams to dig bodies from the sticky wreckage of collapsed buildings couldn't be bothered to send an inspector to climb a ladder and check a few rivets. The same officials who prided themselves on keeping the city modern didn't think twice about letting a massive industrial hazard loom over one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods. In the end, the neighborhood association's warning became just another piece of paper in a file somewhere, maybe tucked into a drawer or left to yellow on a clerk's desk. The people who spoke up could only watch as their concerns were brushed aside, and the tank continued to stand over their streets like a steel time bomb. It's one of those moments in history where hindsight isn't just 2020 it's blinding. And that's why stories like this matter, because they remind us that intelligence, authority, and decision-making power don't always go hand in hand with wisdom. Sometimes, the smartest thing in the world is to listen to the people closest to the problem, even if they don't have degrees or titles. In Boston, in 1919, that didn't happen, and everyone would pay the price. If you're enjoying this dive into the strange, sometimes ridiculous ways history has unfolded, make sure you like and subscribe to Dumb Historian. We work hard to bring you regular videos full of stories just like this one, moments where brilliant ideas and human folly collide in spectacular fashion. And if you think we're missing something, tell us in the comments. We're always listening and like the people in charge of that molasses tank. From the day it was filled, the molasses tank had a reputation not for strength, not for clever engineering, but for being a constant, sticky nuisance. The steel walls were supposed to be airtight, but anyone who lived nearby knew better. Thick, dark molasses seeped from the seams and rivet holes in slow, glistening drips that traced their way down to the ground. In the summer sun, the syrup baked into a hardened crust. In cooler weather, it stayed soft, attracting flies and ants in swarms. It wasn't just an eyesore, it was a public joke. The leaks weren't subtle. You could walk past the tank and actually watch the molasses oozing out, like honey from a cracked jar. The smell was impossible to miss, sweet, cloying, and ever present in the air. People in the neighborhood began to complain to the company and to city officials. They pointed out that if the tank couldn't hold its contents without leaking in plain sight, then something was wrong. They didn't need to understand the exact mechanics of steel fatigue or internal pressure. The logic was simple. If liquid was escaping, the container was failing. Children, of course, turned the whole thing into a game. They brought cups, cans, or just held out their hands to collect the syrup as it dripped from the seams. They would run home with their sticky prizes, grinning, as if they'd just pulled off a daring heist from the candy store. Parents scolded them, worried about dirt or rust in the molasses, but it didn't matter. For a kid in the North End, free sugar was free sugar. Many could tell you exactly which rivets leaked the most and when to visit for the best harvest. If this sounds absurd now, it's because it was. Imagine an enormous water tower in the middle of your neighborhood that constantly leaks not just droplets, but a steady ooze of sticky liquid. Instead of shutting it down, repairing it, or even draining it, the people in charge paint over the leaks and tell everyone not to worry. That's exactly what Purity Distilling did. When residents complained, the company's solution was not to fix the tank but to paint it brown, so the molasses stains would blend in. It was the industrial equivalent of putting a rug over a hole in the floor and pretending the hole no longer existed. To understand how bizarre this was, you have to picture the sheer size of the tank. It wasn't some small container, it was 50 feet tall and 90 feet across. Looming over streets and buildings, it held over 2 million gallons of molasses. A leak from something that massive wasn't just a cosmetic issue. As the company claimed, it was a warning sign that the structure couldn't handle the pressure inside. Steel plates that were too thin, rivets that didn't fit properly, seams that had been rushed into place by untrained workers. Those weaknesses were all hidden in plain sight, dripping down the walls for everyone to see. The people living nearby had common sense, but common sense wasn't enough to sway the company. And the city didn't intervene. It's a pattern you see again and again in history when a dangerous situation unfolds slowly. In small, visible ways, people in power often choose to normalize it rather than confront it. They tell themselves that if nothing catastrophic has happened yet, then nothing will. It's the same kind of thinking that leads to ignoring smoke from a faulty chimney because the house hasn't burned down yet. Some of the older residents began comparing the tank to bad luck omens from the old country. They told stories about cracked barrels, leaky cisterns, and the disasters that followed. A few shopkeepers even joked that they should start selling molasses straight from the sidewalk, since so much of it was freely available. But beneath the humor, there was an unease that people didn't quite know how to voice. This was a giant industrial machine dropped into their neighborhood, and the company running it didn't seem to take its upkeep seriously. It's easy, with hindsight, to see how foolish the whole thing was. But this wasn't just a case of bad engineering, it was a case of willful blindness. Purity Distilling had invested heavily in this tank, and they didn't want to admit there was a serious flaw. Fixing it would have meant draining it, tearing it apart, and rebuilding it. That meant lost time, lost money, and possibly losing face in front of competitors. So they chose the cheaper option. The leaks, just normal settling. The stains, just surface discoloration. The complaints, overblown by people who didn't understand industrial infrastructure. The city's inaction made matters worse. No official inspections, no safety tests, no pressure checks. It was the same attitude that had already let the tank be built by an untrained crew in record time. Once the structure was up and filled, the people in charge simply stopped looking. When you think about it, this is the kind of story that makes you realize intelligent people running businesses, managing cities, designing large-scale projects are fully capable of doing incredibly stupid things. The signs of failure were not subtle. They were visible, tangible, and in some cases, edible. And still, the decision was made, over and over again, to pretend everything was fine. The irony is almost comedic. Children were literally eating the evidence of the tank's weakness, and the adults in charge just kept saying there was nothing to worry about. This wasn't a hidden flaw revealed only after the fact. It was a slow, sticky countdown to disaster that everyone could see, smell, and taste. If this story makes you shake your head, that's the point. History is full of moments where the danger was obvious, yet the people who could have prevented catastrophe chose to ignore it. The molasses tank in Boston is one of the stickiest examples, both literally and figuratively, of how ignoring small problems can lead to very big ones. By the time the molasses tank's leaks had become a running joke in the neighborhood, the Purity Distilling Company had already decided how to solve the problem. They weren't going to repair the tank. They weren't going to drain it. They weren't going to call in an engineer to test whether the whole thing was about to fail. No, their solution was something much cheaper, much faster, and infinitely dumber. They painted it. The tank, originally a dull steel gray, now got a fresh coat of dark brown paint. It wasn't chosen for aesthetics, it was chosen because it matched the color of the molasses stains. The thinking was simple. If people couldn't see the leaks, they'd stop complaining. Out of sight, out of mind. The problem wasn't the leaking syrup, it was that people were noticing the leaking syrup. To anyone with an ounce of common sense, this was absurd. Imagine you've got a crack in your house foundation, and instead of fixing it, you slap on a coat of matching paint and tell your neighbors, they're all better. The crack is still there. Of course, it's just been camouflaged. The Purity Distilling Company was doing the industrial scale version of this. People in the North End immediately noticed a paint job. Some thought it was an admission of guilt, a way to disguise the molasses creeping down the sides. Others took it as a silent warning. If the company couldn't stop the tank from leaking, maybe the whole structure wasn't safe. But Purity Distilling brushed off questions. They said nothing was wrong. The paint, they claimed, was just to make the tank look better and blend with the surroundings. As if a 50-foot-tall, 90-foot-wide cylinder holding millions of gallons of syrup could somehow blend into a Boston neighborhood like a discreet piece of garden decor. The leaks didn't stop, of course. They just became harder to spot unless you were standing close enough to smell the molasses or see it glistening in the sunlight. The neighborhood kids, always resourceful, learned to find the freshest strips by touch. They would run their fingers over the rivets and seams until they hit a sticky spot, then collect what they could. It became a strange ritual, a little treasure hunt under the shadow of a looming dangerous tank. What's most striking about this decision is how openly reckless it was. Painting the tank didn't address the real danger. It didn't thicken the steel plates. It didn't strengthen the rivets. It didn't reduce the immense pressure of the molasses inside. All it did was make the leaks less visible to passers-by and city officials, people who might have demanded the tank be drained or reinforced. In other words, it wasn't just neglected, it was active concealment. And here's the thing. This wasn't the first time in history that a dangerous flaw was literally painted over to avoid responsibility. Industrial and municipal projects have often relied on appearances to buy time or to avoid costly repairs. It's just the kind of short-term thinking that looks clever for about 5 minutes and then collapses under the weight of reality. The molasses tank was no different. The paintbrush became a substitute for engineering, and no one in authority stopped to say, "Why are we actually fixing anything?" If you were a resident back then, you might have felt powerless. The neighborhood association had already complained to the city and been ignored. Everyone knew the tank was leaking, but what could they do? The company owned it. The city approved it. The rest of Boston didn't care, at least, not until the day they would be forced to. So the people living in its shadow carried on. They worked in shops, they raised families, and they hoped the massive brown painted barrel above their heads wouldn't decide to give way. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how human this mistake was. The Purity Distilling Company wasn't run by fools. They were business people, managers, and engineers who had overseen large-scale operations before. But intelligence doesn't protect you from making bad decisions when ego, money, and convenience are in the mix. Instead of facing the cost and embarrassment of fixing the tank properly, they convinced themselves the cosmetic fix was enough. This is the same kind of thinking that leads a ship captain to keep sailing despite strange noises from the hull or an aircraft. A mechanic to ignore a rattle because it's probably nothing. The truly maddening part is how normal this would have looked to people at the time. If a giant industrial structure got a fresh coat of paint, most passers-by wouldn't assume it was a cover-up for structural failure. They'd assume it was just maintenance. In that way, the company's plan worked. The leaks kept happening, but the public record now showed a freshly painted tank, not a glaring safety hazard. But nature doesn't care about appearances. Steel under stress doesn't stop cracking because someone painted over it. Rivets don't stop straining because their rust has been hidden from sight. The laws of physics are entirely immune to public relations tactics, no matter how carefully applied with a paint roller. Looking back now, the paint job stands out as one of the most telling moments in the whole disaster's lead-up. It showed exactly where the company's priorities were, not in safety, not in engineering integrity, but in controlling what people could see. And that mindset, prioritizing image over reality, has been at the heart of more than a few historical disasters. If the thought of painting over active leaks makes you shake your head, you're not alone. Intelligent, educated people made that choice, and they made it with confidence. It's just one of those moments that proves history, isn't just shaped by innovation and brilliance, it's also shaped by stubbornness, vanity, and the hope that a problem will go away if you just make it less visible. January in Boston usually meant frozen streets, thick coats, and breath turning to steam in the air. But January 15, 1919, decided to be different. Instead of biting winds and icy sidewalks, the city woke up to a shockingly warm day. The temperature climbed into the 40s, almost spring-like compared to the frigid weather just days before. For most Bostonians, it was a pleasant surprise. For the molasses inside that giant tank, it was a chemical wake-up call. Molasses is thick and slow in the cold. In freezing weather, it moves like glue and contracts, taking up less space inside a container. But on that unseasonably warm day, the molasses began to expand. And when it warmed up, it didn't just expand, it became thinner, runnier, and faster to move. This change might seem harmless if you're thinking about a jar in your kitchen, but inside a 50-foot-tall industrial tank holding over 2 million gallons, it was a completely different story. The Purity Distilling Company's tank was already in bad shape. We've talked about the leaks. We've talked about the paper-thin steel plates. We've talked about the cosmetic paint job meant to hide the problem. All those weaknesses were still there, quietly waiting. But now Nature was about to do what inspectors, complaints, and common sense had failed to do: push the tank past its limit. As the day warmed up, the molasses inside the tank began to press harder against its walls. Imagine blowing up a balloon and watching the rubber stretch. That's essentially what was happening, only the balloon was made of steel that was too thin to begin with. And the pressure wasn't air, it was millions of pounds of sticky, heavy liquid. The tank's rivets had been straining for months, and now they were being forced to hold against forces they were never designed to handle. Steel expands when it gets warmer, just like the molasses, and that meant every seam, every joint, every flawed section of metal was shifting. The tank wasn't just under stress, it was under stress in motion. That's one of the worst situations for any structure because movement weakens already fragile points. The people who designed the tank should have known this. Thermal expansion isn't an obscure engineering principle, it's something every metalworker, builder, and even ship captain had understood for centuries. But knowing a principle and respecting it are two different things. The Purity Distilling Company seemed to think their tank could handle whatever was thrown at it, as if steel and rivets could be persuaded by optimism alone. On that warm January afternoon, there were no warning sirens. No one was evacuated. The neighborhood went about its day. Workers at the nearby rail yard were loading freight. Children were playing in the streets. Horses pulled wagons along Commercial Street. And just above them, this enormous industrial container was quietly building up more and more internal pressure. If you've ever had a soda can that was shaken, you know what happens when too much pressure builds inside a sealed container. The can bulges. It hisses when opened. And then if you're unlucky, it bursts. Now scale that up to millions of gallons, and replace carbonation with the sheer weight of molasses pressing outward. That's the position the tank was in by mid. Some witnesses later claimed they heard strange groaning noises from the tank, like metal twisting under strain. Others said they heard sharp popping sounds, possibly rivets, snapping one by one. Whether those accounts are perfectly accurate or not, the physics makes them believable. Steel doesn't fail all at once. It bends, shifts, and tears until the weakest part finally gives way. On that warm day, the tank's weakest parts had no margin left. It's one of the cruel ironies of history that the warm weather, which seemed like such a gift to Boston in mid-January, played a direct role in setting the stage for one of the city's most bizarre disasters. The warmth was harmless in itself after all. No one blames a sunny day for what happened next, but it was the final, silent push on a structure that had been failing for years. It's a reminder that disasters often happen when several small things align. Poor design, ignored warnings, cheap fixes, and then, finally, a little nudge from nature. And this wasn't some unknowable freak event. Engineers in 1919 already understood how liquids expand and contract with temperature. They understood that warm molasses would be thinner and more mobile, meaning it could surge against the tank walls with greater force. They also knew that rapid temperature changes could cause stress in metal. This wasn't mysterious, it was predictable. But when smart people convince themselves that a structure is good enough, they can overlook the most basic science. By the afternoon of January 15th, the tank was essentially a giant ticking clock, each degree of warmth adding to the load inside. Nobody in the neighborhood could see it happening, of course. From the outside, the tank looked the same, big, brown, and silent. But inside, the physics were working relentlessly. And when steel, rivets, and liquid pressure are all locked in a quiet struggle, there's only one way the story ends. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, the neighborhood around Commercial Street in Boston was going about its business. Then came a sound that no one there would ever forget. Witnesses later said it was like a gunshot, sharp, sudden, and loud enough to echo off the buildings. Others described it more like a deep rumble, the kind you might hear when a building starts to collapse. Whatever the exact noise, it was the sound of the Purity Distilling Company's molasses tank giving way after years of strain, bad design, and ignored warnings. When the steel finally tore apart, it didn't fail neatly. Rivets shot out like bullets. Heavy metal panels ripped open with the force of a massive explosion. And then came the liquid. Over 2 million gallons of molasses heated by the warm January air and thin enough to move fast surged outward in one enormous wave. People would later call it the Great Molasses Flood, but in that first moment, it was more like a brown tsunami. The wave was estimated at 25 feet high and about 160 feet wide. That's roughly the height of a 2-story house and the width of a 4-lane road. But what made it terrifying wasn't just the size, it was the speed. This was not the slow, lazy molasses you pour on pancakes. This wave moved at an estimated 35 miles per hour. That's faster than most people can run. If you were in its path, you didn't have a chance to outrun it. The force of the surge was devastating. The wave smashed into buildings and splintered them like they were made of cardboard. Wooden houses were lifted right off their foundations. A firehouse on the edge of the street was hit so hard that part of it collapsed instantly, trapping firefighters inside. The elevated train line that ran nearby shook under the impact, and one section of track was twisted out of alignment. Trains had to stop, leaving passengers staring at the chaos from above. People caught in the open were swept away like they'd been hit by a wall of water only. This water was thick, heavy, and sticky. It grabbed at anything it touched and pulled it along. Horses pulling wagons were engulfed and buried. Carts were overturned. Fences and lampposts were knocked flat. Even those lucky enough to be inside sturdy brick buildings weren't safe. The molasses slammed into walls with enough pressure to punch holes and flood the rooms. Once the wave hit, there was no simple escape. Molasses is about 40% denser than water, which means it doesn't just push you over, it drags at you. People caught in it couldn't move their legs fast enough to get free. The harder they tried, the more it pulled at them. Some were pinned against walls or debris, others were swept under the surface. One survivor compared it to being stuck in quicksand, only heavier and with no way to breathe. The sound of the disaster was unlike anything the neighborhood had heard before. There was the initial roar of the tank bursting, followed by the crashing of wood and brick as buildings gave way. Shouts and screams mixed with the strange gurgling and sloshing of the wave moving through the streets. For some, the smell hit almost immediately, a strong, sweet molasses scent that would linger in Boston for months. Rescue in the immediate aftermath was nearly impossible. The same stickiness that made molasses a hazard in kitchens now turned the streets into a death trap. First responders had to wade through waist-deep syrup, each step a fight. Boots were pulled right off their feet. Tools and ladders stuck fast when dropped. Firefighters tried to reach those trapped in collapsed structures, but they could barely move, let alone carry anyone out. Collapsed structures, but they could barely move, let alone carry anyone out. And yet, even in the middle of the chaos, you can't ignore the fact that this entire situation came from human choices. This wasn't a hurricane or an earthquake. It wasn't an unavoidable act of nature. This was the direct result of a badly built tank, ignored safety complaints, and a company more concerned about appearance than integrity. The wave itself was deadly, but the decisions leading up to it had been years in the making. If you take a moment to think about it, it's remarkable how many intelligent, educated people had a hand in this. Company executives who knew the tank was leaking but chose to paint over it. Workers who filled it to the top without questioning its limits. City officials who ignored residents' concerns. None of these people were stupid in the sense of being incapable. They were simply confident that nothing bad would happen, and that confidence became a kind of blindness. When the molasses tore through the neighborhood, it didn't care who was rich or poor, young or old. It treated everyone the same. In minutes, it turned a normal day into a nightmare. Survivors told stories for years afterward about neighbors disappearing under the wave, animals crying out, and the strange, surreal moment when a familiar street became an alien landscape coated in brown syrup. If water had been in that tank, the damage would have been bad enough. But molasses is a different beast. It's thick, heavy, and flows with a strange kind of momentum. At around 40% denser than water, it carries far more force when it moves. That's why, when the tank burst, it didn't just spilt, it destroyed. The wave had the weight and push of liquid concrete. Anything in its path, whether made of wood, brick, or steel, was at risk. Buildings were smashed apart like toys. Wooden walls cracked and splintered in seconds. Brick facades crumbled as the sticky mass slammed into them. The pressure wasn't just on the surface, it wrapped around corners, pushed under doors, and seeped into foundations. Imagine a battering ram that doesn't stop after one hit but keeps pushing, swallowing everything in front of it. That's what the molasses did. One of the most shocking moments came when it hit the streetcar line. A fully loaded streetcar was running along the elevated tracks. When the wave hit with enough force to lift it off the rails, a streetcar weighs many tons, yet the molasses pushed it aside like it was nothing more than a metal toy. Passengers inside were thrown against the walls, windows shattered, and the car was left tilted and stranded, surrounded by a sea of brown syrup. This wasn't water rushing through a gutter, it was a moving wall of sugar, thick enough to crush and carry objects you'd think were immovable. People caught in the surge didn't just get knocked down, they were engulfed. The viscosity of the molasses meant that once it got hold of you, every movement became slow and exhausting. You couldn't just stand up or swim through it. Each attempt to move pulled you deeper, like trying to run through wet cement. Many survivors later said the same thing: it was impossible to breathe if you went under. The syrup coated your face, clogged your nose and mouth, and pulled at your clothes. The more you struggled, the more energy you lost. Horses were especially vulnerable. Several were trapped in the open streets, their legs swallowed by the thick liquid. Drivers tried to cut them free from their harnesses, but the molasses stuck fast, pulling them down. The animals panicked, kicked, and cried out, but the wave's weight was stronger than muscle. Many had to be put down later because rescuers couldn't free them in time. The disaster didn't just destroy property, it took a heavy toll on every living thing in its path. Inside nearby buildings, the syrup forced its way through cracks and windows. People found themselves suddenly knee-deep or waist-deep in sticky liquid inside their own homes or workplaces. In some places, the force was so strong it blew out walls and shoved furniture across rooms. A few witnesses recalled hearing entire sections of buildings groan and collapse as the pressure from the outside overwhelmed the structure. This was not a slow sippage, it was a violent push from a fluid with the density of a solid object in motion. And yet, despite the sheer power of what was happening, many people didn't fully grasp the danger in those first seconds. The idea of molasses, something usually slow, harmless, and sweet, being deadly was almost too strange to process. But by the time realization set in, the wave was already there. Firefighters, police, and volunteers rushed in as soon as they could, but the rescue itself was a nightmare. Imagine trying to run into a flood where every step feels like you re-dragging a weight tied to your ankles. Tools got stuck, boots were pulled off, and ladders sank into the goo. Some rescuers had to form human chains just to pull one person free, and even then, they often risked getting stuck themselves. The strangest part of the whole thing is that this wasn't a mystery of physics. The very properties that made molasses dangerous, its density, viscosity, and weight, were well known. People understood how heavy it was and how much force it could carry when in motion. The fact that no one in charge thought through the consequences of storing over 2 million gallons in a poorly built, leaky tank in a busy neighborhood is proof that intelligence doesn't always mean good judgment. These were business leaders and engineers, people who should have known better. But like so many moments in history, confidence and cost-cutting won out over common sense. That's why we tell these stories, not to laugh at tragedy, but to remember how often disasters are homemade. The Great Molasses Flood wasn't nature's doing. It was the result of a long chain of human choices, each one ignoring or underestimating the risks. And in the end, those choices created a wave of destruction that could lift streetcars, flatten buildings, and trap people where they stood. When the wave of molasses finally slowed, it left behind a scene that defied belief. This wasn't water that could be drained away or mud that could be shoveled out. It was a thick, clinging syrup that coated everything it touched. The force of the initial surge had already done terrible damage. But what made the disaster truly deadly was what came after the suffocating stillness of the sticky mess. 21 people lost their lives that day, and almost all of them died because they were trapped, not crushed. The molasses gripped victims like glue. If someone fell into it, getting back up was almost impossible. It stuck to their clothes, weighing them down, while the density of the liquid slowed every movement to a crawl. Imagine being waist-deep in wet cement, only the cement is warm, sweet-smelling and rising. It pulled on you from every angle, locking you in place while your strength drained away. Those who tried to rescue others quickly discovered they were in almost as much danger as the people they were helping. Once a rescuer stepped into the molasses, they too began to sink and slow. Even pulling on someone's arm was a struggle. Every movement had to overcome the stickiness of the syrup, which clung to both rescuer and victim like it refused to let go. In several cases, rescue workers had to form chains, with men linking arms so they could pull one another free without losing more people to the syrup. Some victims were trapped in the open street, completely exposed to the mess, while others were caught inside collapsed buildings or pinned under debris. For them, the situation was even worse. The molasses didn't just surround them, it filled the space they were in, pressing against their faces and making it almost impossible to breathe. Survivors said the worst part wasn't the weight or the stickiness, it was the way it crept into your nose and mouth, choking you. Even those who stayed above the surface had trouble drawing air because of the strong, sickly sweet smell and the thickness of the air close to the syrup's surface. Firefighters and police worked through the night, using shovels, axes, and even their bare hands to dig people out. In some cases, they had to cut clothing off trapped victims, just to reduce the suction and drag. Horses struggled just as badly as humans. Many were stuck where they stood, unable to move their legs through the heavy liquid. Some panicked so violently that rescuers had to choose between risking their own lives to save them or putting the animals down to end their suffering. The molasses cooled quickly in the January air, turning from a warm, flowing liquid into a thicker, more stubborn mass. Every minute that passed made it harder to move through. Places that rescuers could wade through early on became solid patches of hardened syrup by nightfall, forcing crews to chip away at it like frozen mud. And the mess wasn't confined to the ground. It coated walls, windows, and doors, sealing some shut completely. In some buildings, people were trapped inside not because of structural damage, but because the entrances were glued shut from the outside. Even in death, the molasses didn't let go. Bodies had to be pulled free from the syrup's grip, and the effort was so difficult that it often took several people to move just one victim. Every recovery was slow, every step an exhausting fight against the substance that had turned the streets into a nightmare. The slow pace of the rescue was one of the cruelest parts of the disaster. In a flood of water, rescue comes down to speed. You move fast to outrun the current or reach someone before they drown. But in the Great Molasses Flood, speed was impossible. Rescuers could see people struggling just a few feet away, but couldn't reach them before exhaustion or suffocation set in. Every movement through the syrup was like dragging yourself through quicksand that didn't just pull you down but tried to keep you there. What makes this story so striking is how the very thing that made molasses harmless in a kitchen made it deadly in the streets. Its slowness, its stickiness meant that anyone who fell into it stayed there. It didn't sweep you away like a river. It simply held you until you couldn't fight anymore. And all of this happened not because nature threw a freak event at Boston, but because a company cut corners, ignored warnings, and stored millions of gallons of thick syrup in a poorly built tank in the middle of a neighborhood. Intelligent men, experienced in business and engineering, still managed to make a decision so short-sighted it killed dozens and injured hundreds. History is full of these moments where smart people with resources and expertise somehow convince themselves that nothing will go wrong. It's almost more frightening than ignorance, because it shows how knowledge without caution can be just as dangerous. The Great Molasses Flood is remembered not only for its bizarre and tragic nature, but also as a reminder of what happens when confidence replaces common sense. And all of this happened not because nature threw a freak event at Boston, but because a company cut corners, ignored warnings, and stored millions of gallons of thick syrup in a poorly built tank in the middle of a neighborhood. Intelligent men, experienced in business and engineering, still managed to make a decision so short-sighted it killed dozens and injured hundreds. History is full of these moments where smart people with resources and expertise somehow convince themselves that nothing will go wrong. It's almost more frightening than ignorance, because it shows how knowledge without caution can be just as dangerous. The Great Molasses Flood is remembered not only for its bizarre and tragic nature, but also as a reminder of what happens when confidence replaces common sense. The disaster didn't end when the wave of molasses stopped moving. In many ways, the worst part had only just begun. Boston's North End had been turned into a slow-moving swamp of sticky syrup, and no one had a manual on how to clean up something like this. Water, the go-to solution for any flood, barely worked. Spraying molasses with fresh water just made it spread into a thinner, equally sticky layer that clung to everything: walls, windows, cobblestones, even the sides of horses. People tracked it into their homes, shops, and trolleys. It wasn't just a neighborhood problem anymore. The city itself was covered in the disaster's footprint. Firefighters quickly realized they needed something stronger than fresh water, so they decided to pump in salt water from a fireboat in Boston Harbor. The logic was sound: salt water could help cut through thick organic matter, but reality had other ideas. Instead of breaking the molasses down, the salt water mixed with it, creating an even more stubborn, slimy mess. It didn't rinse away, it clung harder. Imagine trying to scrub honey off your kitchen floor using seawater, only to make it stickier and leave a crusty residue behind when it dried. That's exactly what they were dealing with, only on the scale of an entire city block. The cleanup turned into an exhausting war of attrition. Men with brooms, shovels, and scrapers attacked the hardened syrup day after day, but the cold January air kept turning the molasses into a thick, toffee-like crust. In some spots they had to chip away at it with picks, as if they were breaking ice. In warmer areas, where sunlight hit the streets, The molasses stayed soft and tacky, which meant your boots sank into it and stuck with every step. Street sweepers clogged almost instantly, and the wheels of carts and early motor trucks picked up layers of syrup that hardened and locked them in place. The smell became its own problem. At first it was a rich, almost pleasant sweetness, like the inside of a bakery, but as the days stretched into weeks, the syrup began to ferment. The warm patches baked in the sun, releasing a sour, yeasty odor that clung to clothes and hair. Seagulls and flies swarmed the area, and rats found the streets a buffet. And this wasn't a mess that stayed politely within the disaster zone. Anyone who visited the North End carried the molasses away with them on their boots, on their clothes, even on their skin. Streetcars spread it along their routes, leaving sticky tracks that passengers stepped in at stops, miles away. Newspaper offices downtown found their floors gummy from visitors who had unknowingly brought the syrup in with them. There are reports that the smell of molasses lingered in some parts of Boston for years after the flood, a constant reminder of the day the neighborhood drowned in sugar. Inside homes and businesses, the cleanup was even more personal. Families had to scrub furniture, dishes, and floors. Any cloth that touched the syrup curtains, rugs, clothing was almost impossible to save. The molasses didn't just stain, it seeped into the fibers, bonding with them. Washing it out was an hours-long process, and even then, the smell often remained. Businesses had to close for days or weeks while workers cleaned, costing them money they couldn't afford to lose. Some of the most desperate measures came from people who decided the only way to deal with it was fire. They would scrape what they could into piles and burn it. But this only made the air fill with a burnt sugar haze, adding another unpleasant layer to the already miserable cleanup. And even after the city brought in extra workers, the process dragged on for months. It's easy to forget that this wasn't just about cleaning streets, it was about undoing damage to infrastructure. Wooden supports for elevated trains had been soaked, sidewalks had been eroded, and foundations had been weakened where the syrup pooled and sat. The saltwater solution, while well-intentioned, added to the corrosion, forcing the city to repair parts of the neighborhood as they worked to clean it. The irony is hard to miss. A disaster caused by poor planning and a refusal to fix a leaking tank was followed by a cleanup that created even more headaches, because no one had ever prepared for such an event. These weren't ignorant people, they were city officials, firefighters, and engineers who were used to handling emergencies. But intelligence doesn't always equal foresight. Faced with a problem so absurd it sounded like a bad joke, they had to make things up as they went along, and sometimes those decisions made the mess worse. By the time the last traces of molasses were scraped away, the cleanup had involved hundreds of workers, countless hours, and a small fortune in city resources. The neighborhood was changed forever, not just physically, but in the way its residents remembered what had happened. Every time a hot summer day brought the faintest whiff of sweetness from a wooden beam or a brick wall, people were reminded of the day their streets became a sticky, deadly trap. If you're fascinated by how smart people can still end up in situations like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Dumb Historian. We work hard to bring you strange, unbelievable, and true stories from the past. And tell us in the comments, was there something in this cleanup that you think we didn't cover? Or do you know another ridiculous disaster we should talk about? Your ideas help us keep history sticky in the memorable way, not the molasses way. The cleanup crews eventually scraped the last visible streaks of molasses from the cobblestones, washed down the last storefront, and swept away the final sticky piles. Boston could breathe again, or at least, they thought so. But even after the last broom had been hung up, the molasses had no intention of leaving quietly. It had seeped into cracks in the streets, soaked into the wooden beams of buildings, and worked its way into the very pores of brick and stone. And there it stayed, a stubborn ghost of sugar that refused to move on. On hot summer days, when the sun baked the North End, that ghost would come alive. The air would grow thick with a smell equal parts sweet and rotten, like a bakery had exploded, and no one had cleaned up for weeks. People walking past would catch it first as a faint whiff, then as an overwhelming wave that seemed to stick to the inside of their noses. Visitors might not have understood it, but locals knew immediately. That was the molasses. It had been years since the flood, yet the smell clung to the neighborhood as if the disaster had happened last week. The problem was simple chemistry. Heat makes molecules move faster, which means trapped molasses deep in wood and stone would slowly release its scent as the temperature climbed. In the winter, the smell all but disappeared, hidden beneath Boston's ice and snow. But in the sweltering heat of July or August, The north end turned into a sticky sweet time capsule. It was a smell you couldn't fully escape. Even if you left the area, you might carry it with you on your clothes or skin without realizing it. There's something almost comical about it now. Imagine living in a place where your neighborhood's defining summer smell was not flowers or ocean air, but a century-old sugar spill. But at the time, it wasn't just funny, it was embarrassing. People from other parts of Boston made jokes about the Molasses district. Shopkeepers had to reassure customers that no, their bread didn't taste like syrup because it had been stored in the back room. That was just the neighborhood's permanent scent. For people who lived and worked there, it was a reminder they could never fully move on from the disaster. And it wasn't just a human issue. Insects were drawn to the smell in droves. Flies buzzed in higher numbers on hot days, attracted by the faint promise of sugar. Rats didn't care that the feast had long since been cleaned up, they came anyway, just in case. Even horses pulling carts through the neighborhood would occasionally stop, sniff, and try to lick the walls. Over the years, the molasses odor became a strange kind of folk marker for the North End. People told stories about it, passed down through generations. Older residents would say things like, "You know it, it's going to be a hot one when you can smell the flood." Kids growing up there would dare each other to lick the bricks, usually just once, before deciding they'd made a terrible mistake. It's easy to laugh now, but the truth is, this lingering smell was yet another result of bad decision-making back in 1919. The Purity Distilling Company had built a tank without proper testing, ignored warning signs, and in doing so, they didn't just cause a deadly flood, they left a problem that would haunt Boston for decades. Even after court cases were settled and damage was paid for, you couldn't write a check to get rid of the smell. It was built into the neighborhood like an unwanted landmark. There are accounts from as late as the 1960s of people catching that familiar scent on certain days. Think about that. 2 whole generations later, long after cars had replaced horse-drawn carts and the North End had changed beyond recognition, the molasses was still there, hiding in the cracks, waiting for a hot enough day to remind everyone of its presence. You could be walking to work, sweating under the summer sun, and suddenly be hit by a wave of air that pulled you straight back to 1919, a sensory time machine powered by sugar. And it wasn't just nostalgia or storytelling. Scientists know that certain organic compounds can persist for decades, especially in porous materials like old wood or brick. In the case of the North End, the molasses had been under intense pressure when the tank burst, which forced it deep into surfaces with more force than a simple spill. That's why no amount of scrubbing, seawater, spraying, or scraping could ever fully remove it. For the people who lived there, it became something you learned to accept. Just as cities by the sea accept the smell of salt water, or factory towns once accepted the smell of smoke, the North End adjusted to its sweet and sour perfume. New residents might complain at first, but sooner or later, they'd stop noticing until a guest visited and wrinkled their nose, asking if someone had been baking cookies and letting them go bad. The Great Molasses Flood is often remembered for the sheer absurdity of its cause and the tragic loss of life it brought. But for those who lived in its shadow, the disaster wasn't just a headline from history, it was in the air they breathed every summer for decades. It is a reminder that the consequences of human mistakes don't always disappear when the news cycle moves on. Sometimes they hang around, literally, and make their presence known every time the sun shines a little too brightly. When the tank burst and the streets of Boston's North End turned into a sticky river of death, the Purity Distilling Company had a choice. Admit that their massive steel tank was poorly built and dangerously maintained, or try to point the finger somewhere else. They chose the latter, almost before the last survivors had been pulled from the molasses. The company's lawyers were already floating a theory that the disaster had been the result of sabotage, specifically a bomb planted by anarchists. Now, to be fair, this wasn't pulled completely out of thin air. The early 20th century in the United States was a time of labor unrest, political radicalism, and a real fear of anarchist violence. There had been high-profile bombings in cities like New York and Chicago. Newspapers regularly published headlines warning about radicals plotting attacks. And in 1919, Boston had seen its share of strikes and tension, so the idea that someone might blow up a giant industrial tank was not entirely unbelievable, at least 2 people primed to think that way. But here's the thing. There was no real evidence of a bomb. No witnesses heard an explosion before the tank split open. No fragments of explosives were found in the wreckage. The gunshot sound survivors described was perfectly consistent with rivets snapping under immense stress. The walls of the tank were already known to groan and leak, a fact locals had complained about for months. But the company wasn't interested in telling that story. A bomb was a much more convenient villain. It meant the tragedy could be blamed on malicious outsiders, not corporate negligence. It's worth noting that the Purity Distilling Company had a lot riding on this defense. Admitting fault would open them up to lawsuits from dozens of families, not to mention the cost of rebuilding the destroyed neighborhood. Blaming anarchists was a way to turn public sympathy back toward them and away from the victims. After all, if this was an attack, then Purity was a target too. They could even position themselves as fellow victims, standing shoulder to shoulder with the grieving community against a common enemy. The company leaned into this theory during the early days of the investigation. They hired experts to suggest that an external force must have caused the sudden rupture. They pointed to political tensions, labor disputes, and even rumors of dynamite being smuggled into Boston. But in court, this story began to crumble. The more investigators examined the tank's remains, the more obvious it became that the real culprit wasn't a shadowy group of bomb throwers. It was a combination of shoddy construction and corporate corner cutting. The tank had been poorly designed from the start. The steel walls were too thin to handle the weight of the molasses, especially in the cold January air when the liquid thickened and exerted more pressure. The rivets were of low quality and often popped out under strain. Workers had patched leaks with paint rather than fixing them properly, and management had ignored repeated warnings. Even worse, the company had rushed the tank into service before it was fully tested, because they wanted to get molasses moving during World War I's high demand for industrial alcohol. All of this came out during the hearings, and it painted a picture not of sabotage, but of corporate hubris. The so-called bomb theory started looking less like a reasonable suspicion and more like an act of desperation. It's the kind of defense you make when you know the truth is bad for business. Intelligent people, business leaders, engineers, managers had convinced themselves that this spin might stick, despite the mountain of evidence pointing in the opposite direction. In hindsight, it seems absurd. A tank so obviously flawed that it sang and leaked molasses daily was somehow supposed to have been brought down not by its own weaknesses, but by an invisible band of anarchists who left no trace. It's not just that the company lied, it's that they thought the public and the courts would swallow such a story. And to some extent, they might have, if not for the sheer scale of the disaster and the persistence of investigators. The North End wasn't dealing with a small accident. This was a catastrophe that flattened buildings, killed 21 people, and injured more than 150. It was impossible to sweep away like a minor workplace mishap. Every survivor, every rescuer, every passerby who saw the twisted steel and splintered wood could see the tank had failed in a catastrophic way. As the legal battle dragged on, the anarchist bomb theory quietly faded from the company's defense. It became harder to maintain without hard proof, and the evidence for structural failure was overwhelming. Eventually, the courts found the company liable, awarding damages to the victims. But that initial attempt to shift the blame remains one of the stranger chapters in the story, a reminder that when faced with a disaster, corporations often default to self-preservation over honesty. And really, it's a perfect example of what Dumb Historian is all about. Here you had a company filled with smart people, engineers, managers, legal experts who somehow thought the best way to respond to a disaster was to blame a group of mysterious, possibly imaginary bombers rather than admit their own mistakes. It's human nature, maybe, but it's also a special kind of foolishness. They didn't just underestimate the structural forces acting on their own tank. They underestimated the intelligence of the people investigating it. The Great Molasses Flood didn't just end with a sticky mess and a pile of ruined buildings. It became the center of one of the most important legal battles of its time. What followed was not a quick settlement or a quiet backroom deal. It was a courtroom war that stretched on for years, producing over 3,000 pages of testimony, stacks of engineering reports, and a parade of witnesses who told, in excruciating detail, just how badly the Purity Distilling Company had failed. At the time, corporate accountability laws were still developing. In many cases, big companies could dodge responsibility for industrial accidents by blaming workers, weather, or even random acts of fate. But the scale of the molasses disaster made it impossible to simply shrug and say, well, these things happen. 21 people were dead, over 150 were injured, and an entire neighborhood had been torn apart. The public wanted answers, and the families wanted justice. The lawsuit was brought against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which owned Purity Distilling. On one side, you had a team of company lawyers determined to prove that this was some unforeseeable accident or Better yet, an act of sabotage, as they had tried to claim at first. On the other side, you had the city, the victims' families, and a group of determined lawyers who were ready to dismantle the company's excuses piece by piece. The hearings pulled in engineers, construction experts, and metallurgists. They examined the twisted remains of the tank and found that the steel walls were too thin for the job they were meant to do. In some places, the metal was less than half as thick as it should have been to hold millions of gallons of liquid under pressure. Worse still, the steel had too little manganese, making it brittle in cold temperatures. That meant on a chilly January day, the tank was more likely to crack under stress. Exactly what happened. Witnesses described how the tank had leaked from the moment it was built. Molasses seeped through the rivets and left brown stains down the sides. Residents remembered hearing loud groans and popping noises as the tank strained under its own weight. In any sane world, that would have been a bright red flag to stop operations and fix the problem. But management's solution wasn't to drain the tank or reinforce the walls, it was to paint the whole thing brown so the leaks wouldn't be so visible. The court also heard from company employees, and their testimony painted a damning picture. Workers admitted that the tank had never been properly tested before it was filled to capacity. The reason: management was in a rush to get molasses into production during the high wartime demand for alcohol. Speed came first, safety came second, or maybe third. This wasn't just an accident waiting to happen, it was an accident the company had practically invited. The company tried every angle to escape responsibility. They brought in their own experts to suggest that perhaps a bomb had been involved, or that unusual weather conditions played a role, but the more they spoke, the weaker their case became. The judge and lawyers could see the pattern: a history of ignoring warnings, cutting corners, and hoping no one would notice until it was too late. One detail that stood out was the sheer scale of the evidence collected. 3,000 pages of testimony might not sound like much until you imagine sitting in a courtroom day after day, hearing every witness, every engineer, every cross-examination. The legal teams pored over technical diagrams, chemical analysis, and temperature records. They debated metallurgy, fluid dynamics, and construction standards. This wasn't just a trial about a flood, it was a trial about whether corporations could be trusted to police themselves when lives were at stake. When the decision finally came, it was a landmark moment. The court found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company fully liable for the disaster. They were ordered to pay $628, in damages equivalent to several $1 million, today split among the victims, families, and those whose property had been destroyed. It wasn't just a victory for the people of Boston's North End. It set a new precedent in American law. From that point forward, companies could not simply hide behind excuses or political scapegoats. If their negligence caused harm, they could be held directly accountable in court. This was one of the earliest large-scale industrial disaster cases where the verdict made it clear. Corporate responsibility wasn't just a moral idea, it was a legal reality. In many ways, the Great Molasses Flood helped pave the way for modern safety regulations, inspections, and accountability measures, but it also remains a striking example of how long it can take to force the truth into the light, especially when powerful companies are fighting to keep it buried. And like so many stories we cover here, it shows that intelligent people can make incredibly foolish decisions. The executives and managers at Purity Distilling weren't uneducated. They weren't unaware of engineering principles. They weren't ignorant of the leaks or the groans coming from that steel tank. They just believed they could get away with ignoring the warning signs, and when disaster struck, they thought they could talk their way out of it. That's the kind of overconfidence that makes for great history, though tragically, it came at a terrible human cost. One of the strangest and most embarrassing moments of the Great Molasses Flood trial came when the court started digging into the credentials of the so-called expert who had approved the construction of the massive storage tank. The company had always maintained that the tank had been designed and signed off by a qualified engineer. It sounded reassuring until the details came out. When this engineer took the stand, it quickly became clear that he was not the man the company wanted him to appear to be. Yes, he had been an engineer years ago, but by the time he was asked to look over the tank plans, he had been retired for some time. He wasn't actively working in industrial design. He wasn't up to date on modern safety standards. In fact, his past work had nothing to do with building massive steel tanks filled with millions of gallons of molasses under high pressure. He had worked on completely different projects, ones that didn't require expertise in the kind of structural engineering this tank demanded. Imagine hiring a retired piano tuner to certify a suspension bridge. That's roughly how far out of his field this man was. He had no specialized knowledge of the stresses involved, the properties of the steel being used, or the importance of testing the structure before filling it to the brim, yet he still gave it the thumbs up. And it gets worse. He didn't actually run any tests at all. He didn't order a hydrostatic test, which would have meant filling the tank with water first to check for leaks or weaknesses in the structure. That kind of testing was standard practice at the time for any large container, but it takes extra time and effort. Instead, he just looked at the tank, or more accurately, he looked at the plans and said it seemed fine. This wasn't engineering, this was a casual opinion dressed up as an official inspection. The courtroom exchange was painful to watch. Lawyers for the victims pressed him on specifics. What was the manganese content of the steel? How thick were the tank walls relative to the pressure load? What safety margin had he calculated? The old man admitted, over and over, that he didn't know. He hadn't taken measurements. He hadn't examined he hadn't calculated a safety factor at all. In other words, the entire safety approval process had been nothing more than a company formality. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It meant that from the very beginning, the Molasses tank was a disaster waiting to happen, and the person who had been presented as the safeguard was simply not equipped for the job. The company might as well have had the tank blessed by a local priest and called it an inspection. The revelation also showed how corporate decision-making often prioritized convenience over competence. Why hire a younger, experienced structural engineer with recent training when you could get a retiree likely at a fraction of the cost who wouldn't ask too many questions? After all, an expert who starts pointing out problems slows things down and costs money. Management didn't want delays. They wanted Molasses moving into production as quickly as possible. And so, an outdated approval from an unqualified retiree became the official green light for one of the largest storage tanks in the country. It's the kind of short-sighted thinking that you see over and over again in history. Smart people, people who know better, convince themselves they can cut a corner just this once. They assume nothing will go wrong, and when it does, they scramble for excuses. In this case, those excuses were shredded under cross-examination. The judge and jury didn't need to be engineers themselves to see the problem. The man who had supposedly ensured the safety of the tank admitted under oath that he had done no real engineering work at all. This was negligence disguised as due diligence, and it destroyed any remaining credibility the company's defense had. It also fed into the broader point that the trial was making. The disaster wasn't caused by an unforeseeable event. It wasn't bad luck. It was a direct result of a chain of decisions made by people who either didn't know what they were doing or didn't care enough to do it right. The retired expert was just one link in that chain, but his role symbolized the whole problem. The more the court heard, the clearer it became that the Great Molasses Flood could have been avoided entirely if anyone in authority had taken safety seriously. But instead, the job had gone to a man who, by his own admission, had no idea how to design or evaluate a structure of that scale. This was corporate penny pinching at its worst, and it left an entire neighborhood buried in a sticky, deadly mess. And again, it's one of those moments in history where you can help but shake your head. People often assume the past was full of wise, competent leaders making careful, well-reasoned decisions. But here's proof that even in the early 20th century, companies could be just as reckless as they are today, sometimes more so. More than 100 years after the Great Molasses Flood, Boston still carries traces of that strange and deadly day. The neighborhood where it happened, the North End, has changed a lot. The crowded tenements are mostly gone, replaced by modern apartments, tourist spots, and busy streets filled with traffic. But there's a persistent rumor that on the hottest summer days, when the sun bakes the streets and heat rises from the pavement, a faint, sweet smell drifts through the air. Some locals swear it's the ghost of the Molasses Flood, lingering over the city like a memory that refuses to fade. At first it sounds like just a story, a bit of local color meant to entertain tourists. But when you think about how much molasses flooded the streets back in 1919, it doesn't seem so far-fetched. We're talking about over 2 million gallons of thick, sticky syrup that didn't just wash away. It seeped into the ground, into the cracks of buildings, into the wood of piers and warehouses. It clung to bricks and cobblestones. Firefighters, soldiers, and city workers spent months trying to scrub it out with salt water, sand, and brooms. But even then, they couldn't get it all. Molasses isn't like water. It doesn't evaporate quickly, and it doesn't simply rinse away. It soaks in, and when it's in the ground or trapped in wood, it can take years, even decades, to fully break down. And because this was raw, unrefined molasses, it had its own smell, a strong, almost burnt sweet scent. Imagine a combination of brown sugar, rum, and something just starting to ferment. In 1919, that smell was everywhere in Boston's North End. Reports from the Times said that even months after the flood, if you leaned close to a building near the waterfront, you could still catch a whiff of it. Horses that had been trapped in the flood carried the smell in their coats for weeks. Workers going home from the cleanup effort often complained that their clothes were permanently scented, no matter how many times they washed them. Even the harbor water was tinted brown for a long time afterward, giving off a strange mix of salt and sugar on warm breezes. So when old-timers say that the smell still shows up on hot summer days, maybe they're not exaggerating. Heat has a way of pulling odors out of old surfaces. If you've ever been in a 100-year-old building on a humid day and noticed the scent of the wood, paint, or even old cooking, you know how it works. Now imagine those same hot days hitting ground that once soaked up thousands of gallons of molasses. Even if the scent is faint, it wouldn't be impossible for a trace to rise back up. The idea of Boston holding onto this sweet reminder also says something about how disasters can leave their mark in strange ways. Most tragedies fade into memory, but this one left behind something you could smell. It's unsettling to think that a neighborhood could carry the scent of death and destruction wrapped in something as seemingly harmless as molasses. It's also a reminder of how the disaster itself happened, because people who should have known better ignored the risks. The tank wasn't properly tested. The steel walls were too thin. The expert who approved it didn't understand the engineering involved. The company ignored early warning signs like leaks and groaning noises because fixing them would cost money. And when it all went wrong, they blamed anarchists instead of looking in the mirror. That's why this story fits perfectly into the long history of supposedly intelligent people making foolish, short-sighted decisions. Every part of the chain, from building the tank to approving it to maintaining it, was handled with a combination of arrogance and corner-cut. The lingering smell, whether it's real or just imagined, is like the city's way of quietly reminding us this happened because someone thought they were too smart to fail. The modern North End is a lively, tourist-friendly place now. You can walk the Freedom Trail, eat fresh cannoli, and enjoy the harbor views. But if you stand near where the tank once stood, close your eyes, and let the summer heat wash over you, you might just catch that faint sweet scent in the air. If you do, remember it's not just sugar you're smelling, it's history. Sticky, heavy, tragic history, born from one of the strangest disasters America has ever seen. And honestly, that's what makes it unforgettable. Other industrial accidents are reduced to dates and statistics in history books, but the Great Molasses Flood still has a sensory footprint. It's the kind of story that sticks literally and figuratively.